Let me see.
Yeah, we'll see how it goes.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Maggie, and on behalf of Book Soup, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us for our virtual event this evening with Charles Solomon and Tomm Moore discussing the art of the WolfWalkers. We're so excited and grateful that our bookstore can continue to bring authors and their works to our community during this time. We'll be hosting more virtual events in the near future, and you can learn about them on our website, booksoup.com, as well as our social media at BookSoup. Our next event is tomorrow, April 6th, with Justine Bateman in conversation with Nancy Etkoff, discussing Face, 1 Square Foot of Skin. For regular updates on our upcoming events, please feel free to subscribe to our email newsletter, which you can do on our website. To submit a question during the event, please use the Ask a Question button at the bottom of the screen. If you see a question on the list that you'd like our speakers to answer, please click the like button. We will try to answer as many questions as time will allow. Please do not use the sidebar chat to ask a question. Also, support our bookstore and our authors and purchase a copy of tonight's featured book. Just click on the green purchase button that reads The Art of the WolfWalkers directly below the viewer's screen. The link will redirect you to our website where you can continue your checkout process. We're selling digital audiobooks and ebooks through Libro FM and Kobo for those who are interested. So a little more about Charles Solomon. Charles is a lecturer in animation at the UCLA School of Theater, Film, and Television. An internationally respected animation critic and historian, he's written on the subject for the New York Times, TV Guide, Newsweek, Rolling Stone, The Los Angeles, among others. He has written many books about animation, including Enchanted Drawings, which was the New York Times Notable Book of the Year, and the first film book to be nominated for a National Book Critics Circle Award. In 2008, he received the LA Press Club Award for radio feature reporting. Charles has also done animation programming for the Academy of Motion Pictures and Sciences, the 1984 Olympics Arts Festival, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, the Annecy, Ottawa, and Sundance International Film Festivals, and has lectured at many prestigious universities and academies. A little more about Tomm. Tomm is an Irish filmmaker, an animator, an illustrator, and comic book artist. He co-founded Cartoon Saloon with Nora Twomey and Paul Young, an animation production company based in Kilkenny, Ireland. His first 3 films, The Secret of Kells, co-directed with Nora Twomey, Song of the Sea, and WolfWalkers, co-directed with Ross Stewart, have received critical acclaim and were nominated for the Academy Award for Best Animated Feature. And without further ado, I'm going to turn the camera over to Charles and Tomm. Enjoy the presentation. Thank you.
Good evening and welcome to Book Soup. It's a store I've been shopping at since it opened, I think, and I've always enjoyed. Quick bit of background. I first met Tomm, 11 years ago? When Song of the Sea, when Secret of Kells was just coming out.
Yeah. Back in 09 or 10, yeah.
Yeah, it was the first CTN.
Yeah.
And they asked me, would you do a Q&A with the director of the first feature from Ireland? And I said, well, can I see it first? Because if I don't like it, I probably won't want to talk about it. And they gave me a disc, and I thought, this is gorgeous. This is new. This is something I haven't seen before. I'm delighted to talk to it. And that was when I met Tomm, and we quickly became friends. And I've been writing about his work ever since, because at a time when American animation in particular feels increasingly homogenized and commodified, Tomm's work, in keeping with the best European and Japanese animation, still feels individual and personal. It has a point of view. It has a look that's all its own. And therefore, it has a resonance with its audiences that mass-produced work just doesn't have. So this is still the art of animation, and it's exciting to watch. And I was very privileged to be able to watch WolfWalkers being created.
Well, thanks, Charles. It means a lot. Yeah, I just have to say it meant so much to us. Of course, we knew who you were, and we'd read your writing and various books and everything. And so the fact that you interviewed us that first time was, pretty amazing and humbling. And it was the start of an amazing journey where our work started to get noticed over there. So just a big thanks to Book Soup and everybody for hosting us tonight. Wish I could be there in real life. We've made a commitment. We've heard there's a wine bar. I've warned Maggie and Charles I'll be asking them to join me for a glass of wine there, as is my duty as an Irishman, to take everyone drinking. So I'm looking forward to get to Book Soup. But tonight I'm having some whiskey on all your behalf. I only wish I was there with you in real life. But thanks for being with us virtually.
And I can attest, Tomm has never shirked his duty to take someone drinking. Because you're out with a pro.
You're a bit, I'm bad at living up to the old stereotypes there. But
anyway, let's talk about WolfWalkers, Tomm. And can you talk a little bit? You said that you told me that you had first heard the story when you were still essentially a lad in Kilkenny, and that it was something that interested you, but you kind of filed away.
There was a discussion one day that I remember very well in Young Irish Filmmakers, which was in an old freezing cold orphanage that was well repurposed as a kind of kids film studio. And we used to hang out there after school. So I'd say I was around 13 or 14. And there was a radiator that we would all sit on. And I remember the two, Angela was sort of the business side, Angela Walsh. Mike Kelly had been a theatre director and worked in TV in Australia. And they were kind of the leaders of the group. And I remember listening in on them talking about what Kilkenny was famous for. And they said that Santa Claus was buried here. They said Walt Disney's family originated here. And that stuck in my mind. And I confirmed it at the Walt Disney Family Museum in San Francisco years later, that his grandfather or great-grandfather or something had come from here in Kilkenny. And they said werewolves had come from Kilkenny. And I thought that was unusual. And I challenged them on it because I was sure they were Germanic. And there was some explanation that is lost in the fog of my memory at the time, I'm sure. But it stuck in my mind. And when Ross and I were talking about what would be set the sort of last feature of this kind of triptych that we had in mind, where would we set it? Kilkenny, what would be the local folklore we'd focus on? There's horrible stories of witchcraft and people being burnt at the stake and stuff from around Kilkenny. But more interesting to me was to look into the story of the WolfWalkers, or the werewolves of Kilkenny. And there wasn't a lot, but there was bits and pieces we found scattered between books and online, and kind of rediscovered the stories at that stage, I'm looking around for my book.
When I started researching the book, he walks off, I guess.
Sorry, excuse me, Charles. I just wanted to say this book was very important.
His dressing room wasn't fancy enough. So he, the star walks off the set if they don't have the orchid in the
I just wanted to make reference to this book that was in the corner that I don't know if you saw, Charles, but it was important because it was one of the few accounts, and we found a lot of the old illuminated manuscripts of wolves that were to lead lost saints home through the woods and things like that.
Yeah, so because the wolf walkers Tomm is talking about, and that ultimately figured into his film, are not werewolves in the sense that we think of them. They're shapeshifters, of the sort you find in many Asian films or American Indian legends. They change shape at will generally, and can become wolves or become human, and they're much more benevolent figures. And I remember, Tomm, you're telling me that there was an Irish word that meant son of the land, I think.
Yeah, Machtira. Yeah, Machtira. It was a lovely word for wolf, and I think it spoke to a connection that Irish people had with the wolves, and like the fact that the folklore was hard to find, and the fact that the folklore had died out was very poignant too, because it was stuff I'd been thinking about as well with Song of the Sea. That you lose something of yourself whenever you lose, megafauna like that, or any part of the landscape. So it's interesting. There used to be all these forests, and they were all cleared for the English ships for their empire and to build London and stuff. And there were all these wolves in the forest. And Ireland was known as Wolfland by the English at the time, which was fascinating to me. And now there's no wolves. And also the stories are gone. And that kind of connection between Irish people and the wolves that had used to been equated as one and the same. The English had a sort of speciesist idea that they could kind of denigrate Irish people by referring to how wild and uncivilized the country was because of the wolf population. And we sort of thought that was something worth exploring and looking at, and maybe dragging out and dusting off and kind of painting up and representing for another generation to look at, because it had been fading so much,
Well, also something you might point out, that your co-director Ross Stewart was someone you had been friends with since you were at Young Irish Filmmakers.
Yeah, we were in school together, and we were both into art, and we both joined Young Irish Filmmakers when we started school, and it was a place to experiment. We wanted to experiment with animation and stuff, and they had rudimentary, like it was the 90s, early 90s, so like now everyone can do animation with their phone, but it was a kick just to get our hands on an Amiga and a Genlock and a camera, and we could do animation that you couldn't do anywhere else. But also we took part in all the live action stuff. I met my wife there. I mean, Young Irish Filmmakers, I have to say, changed my life at age 13 or 14. I'm still on the track it put me on,
God, I remember trying to make a film on an Amiga when I was in film school. And although they told me I couldn't do it, I managed to lose the cursor somewhere in cyberspace.
I'd love to find it. I remember some early animation experiments that I was so excited by, bringing home a VHS tape to show my parents that I'd combined a very rudimentary kind of character made out of a ball just by drawing into Lux Paint, and I figured out how to combine it with myself. And so I had a school book, and I was moving my school book, and the characters seemed to walk up and down the school book. So this was the height of technology. Like to be able to do that at all was mind blowing. I know now kids are used to being able to do everything, but in the 90s that was like another, like that blew my mind,
Yeah, well, it's kind of heady to realize you have more power in your cell phone than they did when they were making Tron. That
is fascinating. And when I think about the fact, I remember even when I first started animation school, my friends in the class in first year couldn't believe the equipment that we had down in Kilkenny in Young Irish Filmmakers. And I remember one friend in particular came down and stayed in my house just to get a go on the equipment. And I mean, that was still that was 95. Toy Story had just come out, but still it wasn't commonplace for people to have any kind of serious kit. So we were so lucky. Yeah.
One of the things I think a very interesting story about the making of the film was that the main character began as a boy, and at a certain point you realized, no, it needs to be a girl for the story to work better. Can you talk about Robyn's journey a little bit, please?
Yeah, Robyn honestly wasn't working. He was kind of this strange character that we tried. I think Ross and I, both being vegan and very involved in animal rights and all, imagined ourselves in that time frame and imagined ourselves being some kind of conscientious objectors to hunting, and it just wasn't working. The kid was coming off wimpy. He didn't feel. It felt like we'd done it before as well, in that we'd had a boy and a magical girl, and Nora pointed out, are you saying something you're not meaning to say, always having this human kid meet a magical girl? We were like, yeah, that's true. And anyway, it wasn't working. We were constructing conflict, and the conflict wasn't naturally arising because a little boy in that time period would have been just encouraged to do everything that Robyn wanted to do. And so we came up with the idea fairly early on, I think after a draft or two and not that many sketches, to make Robyn a girl. And it was Inktober. And I drew a kind of cartoon version of my wife as a kid in the exact same hunting gear as the boy had been wearing. We'd been drawing the boy in, and it felt amazing. And it felt like, I could see Liesla as a little girl, being both determined to be a hunter and then passionately in favor of animal rights. And the relationship between Robyn and Maeve made so much more sense. It sparked, and it became really the heart of the story, and it helped us refine the story, because I think at the start we were lost in all the fascinating folklore and history, but having this strong female little girl character and having her up against everything that society was throwing up against girls in those days, because seriously in Kilkenny I think you either went along with how things were, or you could end up accused of being a witch in Kilkenny in 1650, So the idea that this little girl was going against the grain and was going to try and find freedom against the grain of society as existed at the time. I mean, I know there's oppressed groups even today that see a lot of themselves in the story, but that time period in particular gave us a lot of natural conflict for a little girl that we didn't have when it was a little boy.
And Tomm isn't exaggerating, by the way. In Kilkenny, there's one monument to a woman who was, the woman was accused of being a witch, but she was quite wealthy and powerful, and she escaped to England. So instead, her maid was burned as a witch, and there's a big plaque
I
on the
know,
street.
and Petronella's restaurant where they used to live in the old building. I'm not sure if we ate there, but next time we will. But yeah, Petronella was her maid, exactly. And Alice Kittler was famous because yeah, she was like, there was an older Irish tradition of being a lot more matriarchal, and she was in that kind of tradition. But she'd had one too many husbands for people's liking, and she'd had a bit too much power for people's liking, and so yeah, they decided she was a witch and ran her out of town.
That's just because I know some people think Lieselots had one husband too many.
Just the one.
But I also remember talking with you and Nora about the character of the housekeeper who's in Cromwell's household, who's the one who tries to I don't know if she's actively trying to break Robyn's spirit, but she's in herself a broken woman who's condemned herself to silence and just enduring this drudgery.
I have to credit Nora with bringing a lot to that character. Even we ended up redesigning the character. I think in early versions she was a bit of a Brunhilde or Miss Trunchbull from Matilda type, you know. And in the end, Nora brought a lot of nuance in the sense that this was sort of like an older version of Robyn if Robyn gave in, if she let society beat her down. And it wasn't so much do this, it's kind of do it for your own good or else it'll be worse for you, you know. So she was much more a sympathetic character. I think Nora called her Bridget and everything. This is interesting. I mean, it was very important to us as two middle-aged guys telling such a female-focused story to have Nora's input, to have the input from the women on our storyboard team, and also to make sure that we didn't just wander, you know, well-intentioned into tropes that weren't exactly what we wanted to be doing. You know.
Well, and you've also pointed out that all three of your features have had kind of overbearing father figures in them.
I wonder, is it some misaligned guilt or something? I don't know. My own parenting. I don't know. Some stuff, like, I find it interesting to see what people notice, and then I guess for me, I just have to leave it to other people to make of it as they will, because not everything I have done, I've been super conscious that I was doing that for a reason or anything. Yeah, there's a lot of sad dads in my movies for some reason.
No, but again, Bridget becomes an interesting character, but I think the way you portray Robyn, she realizes that could happen to her, and she makes the active decision not to, as when her father admonishes her work is prayer, and she snaps back, I prayed the whole Bible.
Yeah, I thought that was funny. Workers' prayer was probably one of the things I remember learning was part of the sort of Puritan Calvinist creed as a kid. And it was pointed out as a way in which us Catholics contrast it with Protestants, though I have to say we absorbed that to a huge extent. I do feel that sort of overbearing sense of it's good to be miserable, or it's holy to be miserable, and suffering is somehow bringing you closer to God. Like if you were worried, your mother would say worrying is good for you, you know, it keeps you humble or whatever. So I don't think it's entirely local to Protestantism, this notion that work is prayer.
But Robyn is also, I don't know that aspirational is the right word, but she has a sense of adventure, and she wants to be herself, which is, I think, something that makes her very understandable and relatable to audiences. That I think a lot of us, they try and push us into molds, and I think the people like animators who don't let themselves get pushed and become respectable are probably better off. And she's not going to be pushed into that mold, whether it's Bridget or her father who are trying to force her.
Yeah, she's like, I wonder, like, she's definitely it's definitely a movie set in 1650 told by people of today, because I definitely feel she represents a certain spirit in young women today, whether you look at, you know, Greta Thunberg, or if I think about a young Jane Goodall or somebody like that, you know, who go against the grain and show us just how strong a young woman can be. But I presume, and hopefully there was people like that throughout history, but we had a lot of fun with thinking about her. Actually, today I went for a long walk with the dogs as there's not much else to do in lockdown. And instead of listening to a podcast, I found myself daydreaming, and I started wondering who Robyn's mother might have been. And I was trying to imagine an English woman of the time, and I wondered maybe she was an actor in the Globe, and maybe she was a doubly good actor because she would have had to pretend to be a boy to get the part, and then then she could I started thinking about those kind of notions, like those times, how limited women's even to come up with a story for a woman in that time period in England, you have to be quite creative to imagine the possibilities. So. Yeah, but I think a lot of young women have responded to Robyn's spirit, because I do think she speaks to a lot of young women how they feel even today with the pressures that society puts on them.
So is there going to be a WolfWalkers 2, the prequel now?
No, I always said I hated sequels and prequels, but I did find I was listening to Pentangle, the English folk band, and I was like, oh wow, imagine that's how I think that.
In contrast to Robyn, who is in many ways she's an educated young girl and has her own spirit, albeit one that's in contrast to the world around her. You have Maeve, who is a completely free spirit, a live wire, and seems utterly lacking in inhibitions.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like Robyn went through a journey as well, because originally we got deep into the history and the fact that a lot of the English soldiers who came to Ireland came at the promise of raising themselves in the ranks of the world. So people who joined Cromwell's New Model Army, and this is why he's a hero in England, they were often people who didn't have land or whatever, but by coming to Ireland, the first of the colonies, they might be given land, or that was a chance to advance themselves. So we had this idea that Robyn was being trained to be a lady, and that Bill wanted her to rise up in the ranks. It kind of got lost in the so she was really going to be the utter antithesis of Maeve, who was like not a lady, in any shape or form. And we had a lot of fun with Maeve that way. But we also were playing as well, and I don't think it got completely lost in the final movie, but we were playing with the idea that Moll had the opposite parenting style to Bill, where he was like a modern helicopter parent who was afraid of anything, of Robyn doing anything. Moll was entrusting Maeve with all this responsibility. And actually it seemed like, Maeve had to grow into that responsibility over the course of the movie, that at the start she was just a little bit too wild and had been let a little bit too free, so there was kind of that Gilgamesh thing of like they complete each other, that sort of mythic idea that they're like two halves and they need each other to complete themselves. And I think that's how we came up with that image that's at the start of the book of them almost like a yin-yang symbol. When they roll down the hill, we kind of had this idea that Robyn's black cloak could become the opposite to Maeve's red hair, and that they that's how they fit together.
Yeah, well, it seems to me that Maeve also represents more of a traditional Ireland. If Robyn is English and has come over and is aware of being in a strange land, that Maeve is utterly a product of that soil and that forest and that air.
I know. Ross and I used to joke with each other about it, because he's a Stewart, so he was the legacy of the Scots who retreated when Cromwell, beheaded the Stewart, Charles Stewart the first. And my name goes way back, and my family history is that when Cromwell arrived, the Moors were sent to the west, that they were moved off their land, and they ended up in the north. So we had this sort of family history between the two of them, and we talked about that, And so, yeah, that was the idea, that Robyn was, like we call her Robyn Goodfellow after Puck in Midsummer Night's Dream, as a kind of nod to a kind of English fae. And then at Maeve, we had the idea that her people predated St. Patrick, because the WolfWalkers legend was that there was pagans in Kilkenny who wouldn't convert, and what's more, they disrupted Paddy's sermons by kind of howling, and they would howl like wolves to distract people, and also to remind people that there was another knowledge in the forest and not to turn their back on it. But this is why it's neither a blessing nor a curse, but that Patrick was supposed to have said that they would have to, and usually it's 7 years, and there's different variations. We mushed a few things together for our version of it, but basically that those pagans would become the WolfWalkers, and they would be the kind of link between the old ways and the new, and humans and the wild and all of that stuff. Yeah.
Well, and I also remember you're telling me that when you were researching Secret of Kells that some of the stories about St. Patrick actually go back to Lur, the sun god, and that his battle against Crom Cruach.
Yeah, and St. Patrick, there's a story of St. Patrick battling Crom Cruach and him putting his staff in the ground and all the idols all around Crom's mound melting into the ground, and it's literally a transliteration from an earlier. And St. Bridget was a brigade, was a goddess known all across Europe. So there was a lot of I think in the Celtic Church in pre-colonized Ireland there was like sediment, like layers of belief built up on top of each other.
Another we've been talking about the distinction between Robyn and Maeve, but another distinction that runs throughout the film and was one of the things I found so attractive about it visually is the distinction between the way the town is drawn and rendered and the forest is designed and rendered and drawn. And can you talk a little bit about that dichotomy?
Yeah, there was a lot of ideas that we had during Secret of Kells, and I remember Didier Brunner, the co-producer in Secret of Kells, he was also a co-producer on WolfWalkers, and the head of the Irish Film Board at the time. And they sat with all our concept art and went, it's too many different ideas, and they said, you need to simplify down. And I think they were right at the time, and we were trying too many different things, but Ross and I still had those in mind, and I think we learned enough to not just try everything, but to use some of those ideas we were playing with. Because at the time, I loved the fact that comic books could kind of, be sketchy to show a character is really angry, or, the comic book inking could be really expressive, especially someone like Klaus Janson or something, or even then whenever we saw, I remember when I saw The Tale of Princess Kaguya after Song of the Sea was released in Toronto, and I remember I'd been doing all these interviews in Toronto saying that hand-drawn animation was so much more expressive than CG, and then I saw Princess Kaguya and it kind of put me in my place. So I had all those ideas swirling around, and when Ross and I decided that we would make WolfWalkers, we wanted to put in place all the visual language ideas that we'd had, but use them as part of the storytelling. So we said, let's make the town like a woodblock print, like the pamphlets of the time. And let's draw, this was the thing that was exciting for me, was the idea that the cleanup wouldn't just be like final line, but would be an expressive part of the storytelling. So we draw the people in the town, like we'd animate them pretty clockwork and pretty segmented, and that we draw them like, like block prints and with like hard black outlines all around them, like they were really black and white in their thinking and really rigid. And then the people in the forest and the forest itself, we'd render much looser with watercolors and more expressionistic. And I also tried to push it even further, that there was that contrast, but also like when a character was really nervous, they would have a nervous line, or if they were really angry, they'd have an angry line, and the background could change, and just try and use everything at our disposal, And Ross and I were excited about it, and we'd kind of earned our chance to give it a go. And most people we told about it said, that sounds great, but it'll be hard to do, just hard to do with a pipeline. But we had Kaguya, and then in the middle of production, the Spider-Verse came out that did a lot of that stuff. So I was always saying, like, guys, like anytime anybody was saying, oh, are you sure that's a bit crazy? I go, like, we're only, and if you look at short movies, like I love, like Marcel Yankovic's shorts and the Hungarian folktales and stuff, and they experiment with so many different mark making, and they try out so many different things. There's no reason why we shouldn't be doing it in features, and we probably have to do it in features to keep like hand-drawn animation relevant. Otherwise, it's just like, it looks like a little bit of a poor relation to CG.
Well, and that's also what naturally we have the off-scene noise.
So joys of pandemic talks, isn't it? It's midnight here, so I won't be getting calls, I hope.
But you are, I think, starting to see other artists experiment with things like that. For example, in Hosoda's films, in Summer Wars, certainly there's Oz that's drawn one way, and the real And
well, I think Takahata has been playing with it for years. I mean, you go back to My Neighbor the Yamadas, and then in France, Benjamin Renner's been doing it with Ernest and Celestine and the Big Bad Fox. And there was a gorgeous film I saw as well that isn't really talked about as much. It's called The Girl Without Hands, And like, you can't pick a frame from it. I was talking to the distributors, Eric and Dave, who worked with us since Secret of Kells, and they said it was quite hard to make a poster of it because it flickers. It's like a line test by, you know, these masters who only draw what needs to be drawn and they leave everything else for the assistant. So the whole movie, like, is barely there. So it's the purest example of hand-drawn animation, suggesting everything rather than showing everything, which CG does, you know.
Yeah, no, those are all interesting films. In the case of, I know we've talked about in Princess Kaguya, there's the sequence where she wants to flee the opulence of the court, and she runs and is tearing off the layers of robes, and it's really the animator's roughs that they're using.
Yeah, I remember loving, Nora did an internship in Disney in the 90s, and she came back with like cheekily photocopied drawings of Glenn Keane's Tarzan animation, and we would flip that and go, don't clean it up, it's gorgeous, it's like life drawing, you know. And so that, the liveliness and the life, and everyone says the same thing, and all due respect to the cleanup artists, they had a tough job. But when you look at the beast transforming into a man, he's so much more handsome and appealing in the roughs than in the cleaned up colored version. So we were saying that there were these like beautiful movies that were kind of slight, kind of fun movies, like Aristocats and you know, like those like 101 Dalmatians is a great movie, and that was probably the one we honed in on the most because it was so stylish. But they kept the animators' roughs more than later. The assistants didn't take everything away, and the Xerox kind of kept stuff. So that's the kind of stuff we looked at as examples when people were worried about us having scratchy lines.
Even the old Disney animators loved it. I remember Mark Davis telling me that when he saw his own drawings on the screen of Cruella, that was very exciting for him. And I mean, he had animated Aurora, he had animated Maleficent, he had animated Cinderella and Tinkerbell, but that had already been cleaned up. And as you know, if you even if you trace one of your own drawings, it won't have the same life that your original rough drawing did, the looser version.
That's it. And that's what we were trying to preserve all the time. That was the challenge. And we were lucky. There's an amazing animator in Wales called Joanna Quinn, and she draws really loose and rough. And we had two kind of, I refuse to call them cleanup artists. They were like her assistants, and they were like final line artists, Welsh women who joined the team. And they did a lot of that kind of final line stuff. They knew how to keep enough of the animators rough and bring it ready for ink and paint. And that was the style we took with Maeve and the Wolves, and eventually Robyn when she changes. The thing that was so exciting for me was that the writing always has this arc, and I thought, why can't how we draw her have this arc? Like the color often changes, you know, we might let the character's hair down, the voice actor might bring a new intonation to show that she's changed, but wouldn't it be lovely of how we actually draw her changed as she went through her arc? And so I'm really proud of that. It's a really nerdy thing to be proud of, but it's something I always wanted to try.
No, but it's something that while an audience who aren't animators or animation geeks may not recognize, I think they will sense it.
Hope so.
They'll see that she's freer, she's looser, she's moving differently.
I hope so. Yeah, I do think it's subconscious. Yeah, I do remember when I first started in animation school and suddenly being around like animation geeks, like people who had lived and breathed it. And even though I was in Young Irish Filmmakers, even though I was pretty nerdy myself, I remember being blown away that they could spot like a milk cow scene amongst the Robin Hood scenes, or they'd say, look, he has 4 fingers and now he has 3 fingers or whatever. And I was like, oh, wow, whoa, whoa. And then by the end of my first year in college, I could see it myself, you know. So sometimes I'm not sure what the audience sees, but I'm sure they feel it, because I definitely, even as a kid, felt the fact that I was looking at drawings when I saw something like Robin Hood, and it made me feel a little bit closer to being able to do it myself, because I could feel those were drawings, you know.
Well, also, I think conversely, if something is, particularly a human, is animated badly, that audiences will be uncomfortable with it. They may not know why, but it won't feel right. You know, they may not be able to say, oh, the balance is off on the walk, or the rhythm of the step cycle's wrong.
Oh, yeah.
But
it is, and it's
comfortable.
it's a really interesting debate that happens all the time, particularly around feature animation, because I think the tendency with a feature is to try and be as much like live action as possible to be taken seriously. So leaning into what animation can do, but not losing the audience or losing the sense of what they will take. It's been an interesting dialogue through my whole career. And definitely early on, DDA was the one that encouraged us, don't go anywhere near the kind of Disney approach to complete realism, because says you'll only fail because they only manage it, 90% of the time. And they've got all the resources and the experts and everything. So very early on, he encouraged us to look more towards being stylized. And in that, the audience is more forgiving, the budget is more forgiving, and I actually think the artistry is more interesting. There's a lot more to do when you stylize. If you're only aping realism, there's only one direction, but stylized animation can do a lot more.
Well, no, I remember a lot of the great old animators, some of the Nine Old Men and artists of that generation would say, we don't go for realism, we go for verisimilitude. And the character has to be believable. Yes, you'll extend an arm beyond what someone can actually reach to get something, but the gesture reads and the audience understands it. And if you were to limit it to what you can just do in live action, why bother?
Well, I have to say, I've been blown away because I did a lot of life drawing, and I always felt life drawing was something important. Now, one of my heroes is Richard Williams, and he banged on about life drawing all the time. And the fact that after he lost the movie, he went off and did life drawing for a year inspired me. So I was in my own kind of midlife quagmire going, right, after this, I have to change direction. And so I've really been focusing on life drawing. And I started studying with a guy called Carl Gannat, and back into anatomy, which is why I have my skeleton cuddles here beside me and so on. But I've been learning that even in life drawing, you don't draw exactly what's in front of you. If you know your anatomy and you're telling a certain story and some of the lighting or a slight thing, you push the pose. And the way the teacher explained it to me was that a reporter will tell the truth, but they are able to put their own take on the truth. They're able to put their own, and that's what you do as a, so even when you're copying from life, there's a need for that little push that the classic animators did. So they didn't just rotoscope, crappy rotoscoping compared to the way that they used it in the old Disneys. It's totally different because you're pushing it and helping every frame tell the story a little bit better. And it's with your brain switched on rather than brain switched off. And I think that's the difference,
Yes, well, I would point out that when I quote you, you sound more grammatical than when you're just talking.
I apologize. Maybe some whiskey.
But no, that was something Mark Davis in particular talked about. And he said, if you organize your lines correctly on the page, you can communicate a sense of anatomy, of depth, of lighting, of attitude, of even acting. And you can make something seem to recede into the page or come forward. But you have to understand the principles of drawing and of anatomy. Then you know what to distort and what to leave out and what you can change.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And Mark Davis is a perfect example. I've got that book, The Renaissance Man. And when you look at his stuff, you're just like, wow, that guy was truly. And that's the thing I think is so important in hand-drawn animation, that we keep that like overall approach to art. Like we had people on the team who were sculptors like Jean-Baptiste, people who were like printmakers, people who were painters. And I think it's so important that you don't just look at animation, but you have a broader art, like a discipline or practice.
Well, that was true. When we talk about the Nine Old Men and the great Disney artists, none of them wanted to be animators. Woolly Reitherman and Ward Kimball wanted to be watercolorists.
Right.
Mark Davis was interested in anatomical drawing. Mel Shaw wanted to do bronze sculptures like Frederick Remington. And so they brought a knowledge of not only of drawing, but also of art history to their work. And so they weren't just animation geeks. They would never look at other people's animation to copy or to style. And I think one weakness in a lot of contemporary animation, though not in yours, is that people will say, oh, a walk. Well, Milt did a really interesting one in such and such. I'll look at that. They went out and watched people and looked at the world. And I think that's what you're doing with your life drawing.
I think as well, like Dick Williams was a big influence on me as a young man. I mean, I'm sure there's lots of criticisms now of his stuff. He was of his time, but what he said was that animation, he loved the principles he was gathering from the Nine Old Men, but he didn't want to do what they'd done. As he said, he didn't want to drink their bathwater. He wanted to take it and do his own thing. And he had these really high-minded ideas that animation could still be Rembrandt or could still be art, and anything you could draw, you could animate using the principles of the Nine Old Men, but didn't have to look like a Disney character. And that's something I think is at the heart of the studio, that we kind of went, wow, that is so exciting and so interesting, you know.
Well, that was what first excited me about Secret of Kells, that here was something from my art history classes I recognize as being rooted in illuminated manuscripts, but it was moving in ways that were appropriate for those designs. You weren't trying to do a Disney three-dimensional sort of movement with those characters because they're not designed for it. But you were finding ways to move those characters that were consistent with the design sense and the general aesthetic that underlay them. And that was new and very exciting. And the way I was going to say, okay, finish up complimenting you, the way that
oh, please don't stop.
When the characters in that film in particular are grouped together, they form shapes that relate to their individual forms, but are a more complicated whole that's still aesthetic and still pleasing, but they're both part of a pattern and they're themselves. And that again was new and interesting and something that I think you've kept with through your other films.
That's what I was going to say. It's been interesting because there's been this kind of interesting thing in the studio that at the start we really had to encourage people to let go of some biases that they had, that something wasn't, good if it wasn't, sort of Disney style. And on the other hand, now we've been going for so long, there's some young people who joined the studio because they were inspired by what they saw in Secret of Kells. So it's been really interesting. And also, I mean, on WolfWalkers, we pushed into something else. We kept some of that. Like I said, like the soldiers moved like clockwork to show their inner workings. But we really were pushing the character animation much further. And it was really exciting because, we had somebody like James Baxter visit the studio and do a talk. And everyone's brains were on fire with excitement after hearing him. And he did a couple of scenes. And I think that was really amazing because I think the animators in the studio felt like, after Breadwinner, they'd done some really nuanced acting, and they felt they were able to kind of let loose a little bit with WolfWalkers because it was that much more cartoony. And I think they were happy that we were playing with going all the way from like background characters that were just like Secret of Kells. They were just like a big mass, a big shape that you animated as a mass, all the way to like some like subtle character animation between Maeve and her mom and Maeve and Robyn. So I feel like the studio has kind of grown and improved and plus that kind of those first ideas that we had in Secret of Kells over the years.
I would agree because there's some very subtle stuff, I think, particularly between Maeve and her mother when she's trying to break her trance. Your heart is in your throat. You're feeling for this character. And it's not, I mean, you found good actresses for both characters and for Robyn.
That's true.
But it's not the voices that are entirely telling the story. You're telling it visually, which is what animation is supposed to do. It's not illustrated radio.
Yeah, I don't know if we would have dared try to do something as subtle and poignant with just one character acting alone on screen against a kind of sleeping partner back in Secret of Kells days. So I do think that that's a good example of a scene that, it's like one locked off shot. We weren't playing with, usually I think because we didn't fully trust that we could do the performance, we threw a lot of art direction at everything. We had a lot of shots with lots of other things to make sure that we could get the emotion across, even if the character animation had to be, by nature of the budget, quite stylized. But this time, because I think we'd seen it in Breadwinner. I think Nora had pushed it out with Breadwinner, and I was excited to have a bigger budget and to be able to try some of that stuff. So scenes like that were definitely, there's a couple of scenes that we left, and more than one storyboarder or editor said, that's a long scene to not cut. And I just kept on pointing at what Nora had done on Breadwinner and said, no, let's do it. We rarely see it,
Well, no, and that's something I hear from a lot of American animators complain. They said that if you look at the classic Disney films, there is time for the characters to act and react and think. And in so many recent films, it's cut, 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 cut. Like the audience doesn't have the intelligence to follow it. And
I think there's
I think that impoverishes the filmmaking and the art and the animators.
Yeah, I think there's a trend to it. We talked about that a lot because we were looking at 101 Dalmatians, for example, and a friend of mine, David O'Reilly, who's like a CG animator, but he hung out with us as a teenager. He done a whole breakdown of the man. What's the man's name? Roger coming down the stairs, thinking of the tune, and like he just broke it down, and we were looking at it over and over again, and it really did seem like, you know, like actors, people who were really good song and dance men, you know, really performing. And the layout was beautiful. It was so stylish and everything, but it was really just a simple moment. And then there's another lovely scene that was made into a flip book whenever he's really sad and he thinks that the puppy is dead, you know. And then there's a moment whenever they jump when the nurse comes in to say the puppies were born. That's the part in the flip book. But those kind of scenes were pure character animation, and they were boarded with the trust that the character animator could make it work, and it wasn't going to need lots of cuts and music and everything to make it work. You know?
Well, and I always think of the first scene when Cruella enters and you know, comes banging in. And I asked Mark about the character of the 9 Old Men. I knew him the best, and he said, well, there were a lot of partial models for her. There was the actress Tallulah Bankhead. There was a friend of his wife's whom he didn't like. But he said, basically,
that's a good idea.
He said, basically, I set out to make her move like someone you wouldn't like.
Very good.
And I thought that's a really interesting challenge and an interesting idea for, okay, how do you animate that?
Yeah, and I think that's really also really important for authenticity. Even if you're doing stylized animation, usually, I mean, we thought about Sean Bean when we were designing Bill Goodfellow right from the start. And as I said, I thought about Liesl as a little girl when I thought about Robyn. And Paul's daughter, Robyn, was quite the model for Maeve. And she has the hair and she was just as wild at one point. And I think it's quite good to have somebody in mind, even if it's not the only model. As you say, you can combine other people, but it's quite good, especially if you're going to have to live with the character for a long time. You've got to really love them or really hate them with a lot of passion to kind of motivate you all the way through like 4 or 5 years of living.
Well, I think you have to know them.
That's true.
And I remember Glenn Keane saying of Tarzan that he felt he could just stand there with his hands on Tarzan's shoulders and he would know what he was thinking.
Yes,
and that he knew the character that well to be able to move him as he did.
Yeah, I think it's different. I mean, I think there's something really special, and we toyed with that early on, and we did have sort of leads, but we didn't. That method where one animator would get to know a character so well is something that I still haven't been able to try due to the way our productions are. But I'd love to try it because it is fascinating thought that somebody just through drawing the character so much would be. And even when you think about it, I think I saw Glenn Keane drawing in VR, and I could imagine because he draws like that. He draws quite sculpturally. You can see with the thick and thin that he's thinking like that. And that's the thing that's in the rough that I like to see. And that's why, like, say, for example, Joanna Quinn's shorts or Marcel Yankovic's stuff like Sisyphus, you feel something more in an uncleaned up line because there is. Ironically, even though it's a 2D image, there's a form and three-dimensionality to it just from the intention of the line. You know?
Oh, there's also an energy. I remember one of the old artists saying that the pencil tests for Night on Bald Mountain looked like a Michelangelo in motion.
I can imagine.
Title's roughs were just amazing. And I also remember once Glenn flipping a scene for me, and the drawings looked like little more than scribbles individually. It was when the eagle is tickling Cody in Rescuers Down Under. But when he flipped it, you saw the movement and the attitude and the laughter, and everything was there in just those circles of soft pencil.
And I don't think you have that for a long time with CG. It's different. You're building up, and sometimes the character doesn't have hair until the physics are applied and so forth. There is something, and not to denigrate CG, because there's some beautiful work being done in it, but I do think that's the magic of hand drawn. That, yeah, just like we said, the boy without, or the girl without hands, or Kaguya, or any of those films that dared to just leave it as animators' roughs. There is something really magical in that.
Yeah, it's again, there's an energy to the original drawing that you just can't. It goes out of it inevitably. Even if you trace your own drawing.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. Remember
Anyway,
Paul when we first started? Oh, sorry. You want to go?
Oh no, go ahead. Go ahead.
I just wanted to say that Paul, when we first started working together, we would Paul doesn't draw as much now, but back then he would tear his room upside down to find the original rough. He would never wanted to trace or to redraw. If it had a spark to it, he felt that first drawing was the one that was worth, digging for. So I always remember that too, because of course in college we were learning to trace back and in between, and drawings weren't precious. Throw them out, do another one. So there is a balance there.
Now the other thing Milt Call said, if you really need to do that much erasing, do another drawing and get it right.
Yeah, exactly.
So Maggie, I think we're about out of time. Do you want to wrap things up and we'll let Tom go to bed? Well, I mean, it's getting late there, isn't it?
It is a little late, but if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer them before I go and hit the hay.
Hi.
Hi.
Well, thank you for staying up. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
And mine.
Okay, so that's a wrap on our presentation. Thank you so much to our guests and to all of you who tuned in this evening. We greatly appreciate everyone's time and your support of independent bookstores. Support our bookstore and our authors and purchase a copy of tonight's featured book. Just click the green purchase button that reads The Art of the WolfWalkers directly on your screen. If you'd like regular updates on our upcoming events, make sure to follow us on Crowdcast and subscribe to our newsletter. Thank you both again and have a good evening.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Charles. Thanks, Maggie. See you soon, I hope.
Yeah, I hope so too.
In book soup for a glass of wine.
Yeah.
We're here.
Night, night.
Good night. Say hi to Lisa a lot.